Nebraska. Oh, God. Don't ever go to Nebraska.
What, did he make you go in a covered wagon? I mean, you had air conditioning, right?
Might as well have been. No, it's just a lot of that. There's a lot of really cool things in this world, but you have to drive forever to get to them.
Yeah.
So our road trips, as wonderful as they are, have been kind of boring.
Oh. The Pat Conroy Cookbook is part recipe book and part memoir of the celebrated author's remarkable life. Or, as he says in the introduction, this book is the story of my life as it relates to the subject of food. It is my autobiography in food and meals and restaurants and countries far and near. Each chapter opens with a story from his life, and fans of Conroy's fiction will recognize some anecdotes that eventually wound up in his most beloved novels. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where we get to know interesting people by asking them about their favorite book. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and my guest today is someone I've known my entire life, my mom, Betsy Dunn. My mom is the reason I am a reader, and many of the books she's given to me over the years rank in my all-time favorites. I was really curious that she didn't choose a fiction novel, since that's usually our jam when we talk books. But instead, she chose a cooking memoir that was great fun to read with her. We talked today about books and cooking and travel, and why the Pat Conroy Cookbook is the best book ever. Hi, Mom. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Thank you. Hi, Julie.
This is fun. This is a different thing to be doing with you. Well, we always talk about books, but talking on a recorded conversation is new for us.
Definitely.
Mom, I have talked about you a lot on this podcast whenever we talk about childhood reading, and I've said so many times that, foundational to me becoming a reader was that I always saw my parents reading. Always. Like when I grew up, there were just always books around the house. How did you become a reader?
I don't think I can answer that except to maybe repeat what you said. My mother was always a reader. My dad, not so much, but definitely the newspaper, 2 newspapers a day, morning and afternoon, always the sports page. But I always read. I have vivid memories of the Bobbsey twins and Nancy Drew, and we certainly didn't have the choices that everybody has nowadays, but I've always loved reading. It's always been central to my life.
What did Grandma read? Because I recall her always reading like romances.
Trashy novels. Absolutely. Absolutely.
What are your go-to genres now?
I can pick up anything by Nora Ephron, Anna Quindlen, probably women about my age. I don't know what their genres would be exactly. Anna Quindlen is a newspaper columnist and a novelist, and she's written kind of a wide variety of things. But I can always pick up one of her books and be entertained by it.
You reread a lot?
Absolutely.
When I was a kid, you always had romances, Danielle Steele. But it seems like in my adult years, you've really sort of drifted away from romances and gotten more into like what you're just saying, like the domestic dramas or women's fiction or things like that.
Historical dramas I love. I'm just trying to look at my bookshelf and, anything that's been recommended to me. And when you asked about rereading things, as you know, we had a very cold, wet winter. So I've done a lot of rereading. And when you first asked me to do this podcast, I had just finished rereading The Red Tent.
Oh my gosh.
And I thought, that's it. That's the book I'm going to talk about with Julie, because it is fabulous the second time. So rereading is, to me, almost a necessity, because I look at my books and I remember how much enjoyment I got from them. And The Red Tent is basically a romance set way back when, but with so much history and religion and It's just such a rich read.
I don't think I've read that one. I think, well, I know you gave me that. I'm sure when it first came out, you pressed it into my hands. I don't think I've read it since then. And oh my God, I'm going to reread that. That is
Reread
such
it. You'll enjoy it. It's so good.
Did you ever get into anything else by her?
Yes, I read The Last Days of Dogtown, and I actually just reread that, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. And in my book club, we kind of have an unwritten rule that a couple people have to read a book before we select it because we've had so many duds. So I gave it to my friend Sharon, and I said, read this and tell me what you think about it, because I really enjoyed it. She hated it.
Oh my gosh.
It is such a, it's about this little mountain town with a bunch of depressing, poor people who lead these miserable lives, but it ended up kind of happy. And I just enjoyed reading about the characters. Sharon, on the other hand, thought it was terrible and couldn't believe that Anita Diamant had written it because it was so different from the red tint.
Tell me how your book club works. Do you vote on the books?
No, it's really loose, but we'll ask, has anybody read anything good lately? We have one member in our book club whose husband, he's an avid reader of everything. So usually his wife brings a couple of recommendations, and they're usually pretty good ones. There's another woman, Celia, who always has good recommendations, usually more historic books, little heftier books. And she's always a good, reliable one. So we'll discuss a couple of them. And then there's always somebody who says, well, is it out in paperback yet? Because they're cheapskates. Sorry, Sharon. and somebody will log on and say, oh, yeah, you can get this on Amazon or you can get it on Thrift Books. And so it's just a discussion and we make our decisions that way. And I would say 98% of them are good choices.
What are you allowed to show up if you didn't like the book?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We definitely have members who don't always read the books and they're told to sit down and be quiet because they bring other things to the book club. I didn't hate our last one, but really disliked our last one. So I'm going to the book club luncheon on Monday, armed and dangerous, because everybody was telling me, oh, it was so good. And I cried and, oh, you're going to love it.
What was it?
Remarkably Bright Creatures. It's a new bestseller. You would hate it.
Okay.
You would hate it. And I did buy it at a bookstore, so I will give it to you. But and you can give it away. But yeah, I didn't like it at all.
So is there anything that is a hard no for you? What are your absolute, like if someone brings it up in book club, is there any genre where you will say, I absolutely will not read that?
Most murder mysteries or violence, anything, all this new vampire stuff just leaves me cold. I have no desire to read any of that.
There's a great line in Ted Lasso where Ted Lasso meets his boss's mom and he goes, I love meeting people's moms. It's like an instruction manual for why they're nuts. And I just feel like you saying you won't read anything scary, like all the podcast listeners are going, oh, this is why Julie's nuts. You see, listeners, I come to it honestly.
Yeah.
So what did you do? This is sort of an odd question, but because I think it's an odd question because I just don't think your generation thought as hard about parenting as my generation did.
Oh, absolutely. The proof is in the pudding.
Noting this one down for the therapist. It's fine. But what did you do to encourage us to read? Was it intentional at all? Because my sister and I are both readers, her not as much as me, but she's still very attached. She's especially into comfort books. She's a big old rereader. Did you do something to say to yourself, I really want these kids to become book lovers?
I don't remember consciously doing that, But remember, if you would ever get sent to your room, you didn't have a TV and a computer and an iPhone. You had some books. So I sent you to your room a lot, maybe.
And
But
I
no,
loved it.
yeah.
Honestly, I loved getting sent to my room. I was like, right on.
So was the library a big part of your childhood? Did we go to the library a lot?
Yes.
Okay.
I can describe the Palm Desert Library. I can see the inside of it. I know precisely where the records are.
Oh my gosh.
And I remember like the reading, the summer reading thing. And I remember distinctly and vividly how it smelled inside. It's the best smell of my whole life.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm impressed with me as a mother.
Yeah, see? Look what you've done.
And I thought we were just trying to get out of the heat.
Well, I'm sure that's partially what it was, right? Like we lived in, it was 1,000,000 degrees outside, and it's not like we were swimming in money. It was probably great for you to get us there and get us out of your hair.
Yeah.
Also, I remember being dropped off. And when I think back, it's probably not as young as what's in my head, but I do remember you dropping us off and like going off to run errands and just sort of leaving us there.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Well,
unsupervised, probably with murderers.
probably. Yeah. They used to hang out at the library a lot.
I knew it. Okay, so in the two writers that I really associate with you, as I've said many times, Danielle Steele, of course, but also I really have always associated Pat Conroy with you. I know for a fact that you gave me Prince of Tides, also probably right when it was released. But tell me your history with him and his work.
To be very honest with you, a lot of his books bother me. He seems to go sometimes over the top with violence.
Mm.
But he claims, as I've read in this newest book, he claims it's all based on fact. In other words, this really did happen to his sister. There really was a tiger tied up behind a gas station that I think was in the Prince of Tides. He claims all of these little tidbits are true, but they always seemed a little bit overblown to me. And even his latest one, I think, was Beach Music, which was a good book. I really enjoyed it. It's about young people who grow up kind of friends, and there's a brother and sister in it who just suffer terrible violence at the hands of their father. And even though the whole book was good, the violence in it, it just kind of turns me off a little bit. So I can't say Pat Conroy's always been one of my favorite authors, but I'll always read his books.
I think I remember you telling me that Grant Santini was based on his dad.
Yeah, yes. And then there's another book called The Death of Santini, which is really good. And those kids, the Conroy kids, had just a dreadful childhood, and they all ended up loving their mom and dad.
What do you think is the appeal of his books? Like, even though the violence freaks you out, like what draws you back to him, do you think?
Probably how descriptive everything is, because I guess as much as there's, dreadful violence, there's beauty in what he describes. Like the great Santini, when he talks about his father, the Air Force pilot, flying over his school and tipping the wings of the plane, he was so proud of his father and his life. And Pat Conroy can just bring out the best and the worst in people, in his characters, in his writing.
Do you remember how you found this book that we're talking about today, the Pat Conroy Cookbook?
I found it online at Thrift Books, and it was like $3. And I thought, what the heck? And I got it.
Were you looking for it?
No.
You just happened upon it?
Yeah, I just do a lot of, I probably typed in Pat Conroy and saw that he had a cookbook, and it was cheap, and I got it.
So will you tell our listeners what it's about?
Yes, it is much more a memoir than a cookbook. And it's about his travels. It's about his children. It's about his wives. It's about the women he didn't marry, but he should have. And a little bit about his childhood and with recipes thrown in. And he never should have named it the Pat Conroy Cookbook, because I don't think cookbooks sell nowadays. I went to the library bookshop and there's a whole rack of cookbooks, $1 each.
Mm-hmm.
They just can't seem to give them away. If he had named this something else, I think it would have been a bestseller because it's just charming and delightful.
Yeah. If he'd had named it something like the Pat Conroy food memoir is a better description anyway, because there are tons of recipes, but it's like half memoir and recipe.
Much more than a cookbook, much more than a cookbook. Like the one quote that I'd highlighted when he's talking about his dad, and his dad had just given him the end of a story. Pat said, I could reward him with food because it is my most religious belief that a recipe is just a story that ends with a good meal. I mean, come on.
That is good.
Yeah. He's just such a good writer. For instance, one of the recipes that I have flagged that I'm going to make someday is called Sandra's Mama's Pound Cake.
Someone's mama's pound cake is always the best pound cake.
Right. Here, listen to the title of this chapter.
Okay.
Why Dying Down South is More Fun. Cooking food for a grieving family and their friends is still one of the classiest ways to send a love note that I can think of. I get teary-eyed and grateful when I think of the sheer amount and quality of the food that the people of Beaufort, South Carolina, sent to my house after the deaths of my mother and father. Such generous responses tie you to the places forever.
Oh,
yeah.
That's good.
And that's real life. I mean, you've just been through a similar situation, and generosity like that matters. My family was overwhelmed by the kindness of the neighbors who had loved our parents. They cared for us, fed us wonderfully, comforted us, and eased our grief of our parents passing with astonishing grace.
Yeah, it's literally keeping someone alive. You know, you're literally nourishing them to get through the next hour of whatever they're dealing with. It's
right.
It's so simple and it's so incredibly generous.
Yeah, whenever he loses someone, whenever someone passes away, he makes his pickled shrimp. And he says he expects every fishmonger in South Carolina to run out of shrimp when he passes away. Well, of course, he already has passed away, but that's what he wants at his funeral. And I've made the pickled shrimp and it's great.
I'm sorry. Pickled shrimp sounds disgusting. What is pickled shrimp? It's
just a cold nibble, a cold appetizer kind of a thing. It's good.
Wait, like, do you put it raw, like in pickle brine?
Yeah.
How do you eat it?
As an appetizer. It might be like poached in the pickling juice. It's got to be cooked. I wouldn't eat it raw. Boy, if you don't like that, wait till we get to the part about oysters.
Oh, okay. No, let's talk about this, because when we were getting ready for this, you sent me a picture and you said, Pat Conroy made me do it. Why don't you tell our listeners, is it okay with you if I share that on Instagram, those pictures?
Absolutely.
Will you tell our listeners what is going on there?
Yeah. So my husband and I are retired, and we both like to keep busy, and we're always looking for interesting things to do. So I had read this, and the chapter is called Oyster Roasts. And I think I've tried oysters in the past, probably like on a dare, maybe like Julie when we were in San Francisco.
Yes, I remember that at the ferry building.
Yeah, and I'm completely unimpressed by them. I mean, you can't swallow them fast enough. So I saw on Facebook, one of my garden club friends had said, hey, this would be a fun field trip. And there's an oyster farm down in Carlsbad. So I told your dad, get dressed. We're going. We've got a 9:00 tour booked. And we went down there.
I bet he was thrilled.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he was really happy. And so we went down, and went to Carlsbad Aqua Farms, and we're standing out right on the ocean, and you get it's an oyster farm, and oysters and mussels and how they're raised and what they are. And then you go to this tasting area, and everybody had different tables and were handed gloves and knives and a bucket of oysters. Well, your dad never had tried an oyster, but he was into the moment. And you can see from the pictures, I mean, I bet he downed 10 oysters, and he got so into shucking them because it's a kind of a manly thing to do, you know. And then you take this oyster and you either put lemon on it or Tabasco sauce, and you toss it back. I still don't get it. I mean, I did it that day and it was fun, but if I went into a fish market tomorrow, I would not order oysters. And you know, and they pay a fortune for it.
Mm-hmm.
And we frequently, if we're on the road, we'll stop at King's Fish House for a cold beer and a bowl of chowder or something. And we'll sit at the oyster bar, and it's incredible to watch these huge trays of oysters and mussels go out. And I don't get it. I still don't get it. You want to hear what Pat Conroy's mother says about oysters?
Yes.
His mother held a special contempt for the lowly and despised oyster. I remember her wrinkling her nose as she held a pint of oysters aloft, saying, "I wouldn't eat one of those balls of mucus in a famine." He never had seafood or oysters until he was an adult living in Beaufort, South Carolina. And they were Catholic, and on Fridays they had to eat fish. And so they had fish sticks, and all of his siblings thought that fish were little round rectangular things breaded and fried. So he became a lover of oysters and all things seafood as an adult.
And he has this recipe in here for oyster roast, but it sounds really good. Like, because it's not, well, I mean, it's 12 dozen oysters. Oh my God, that's a lot of freaking oysters. But it's also got bratwurst sausage and smoked sausage and chorizo. So basically, you're just trying to kill the taste of the oysters, I think, with all those.
Oysters have no taste. They're just, except for they taste like the sea. They taste like the tides. And that's how, I get it. I get the eye roll. I'm with you.
Didn't you hit some Pat Conroy places on your recent trip?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. We went to Beaufort, South Carolina, which is what he finally called home. He was an Army brat and never felt like he had a hometown. And his mother told him, pick one and call it your hometown. And so he picked Beaufort. And he just writes this love letter to Beaufort. Well, we had the most terrific day there. It's just a charming little town. Prince of Tides was filmed there. The Great Santini, Forrest Gump, The Big Chill. The Big Chill's house is right there in Beaufort.
No kidding.
It's just a wonderful town. And I learned all of that from this book. And he says, the founding fathers of Beaufort agreed with me and put one of the loveliest towns in America on its high banks. And they lined Bay Street with a row of kingly mansions that looked like a row of wedding cakes when viewed from the river. Now, if I had gone there and had not read this book, I would have looked down Bay Street and said, wow, what pretty houses. But I went there and I saw these wedding cakes, and it just enriched the story of that trip for us.
Okay, listen, my sister and I have teased you a lot over the years.
Really?
I know you don't know this. But in all honesty, you and Dad are the best cooks we know now. Truly. But when we were kids, you were the worst. And I know it's because you both were working full time and raising two rotten kids. And when I think back to like family dinner of my youth, you were totally disinterested because it was just another goddamn chore, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
But like I tell my kids now, like when the kids ask me for a grilled cheese sandwich, They wanted exactly the way you and Dad make it for them, which is like artisanal bread and really expensive cheese and crusted in Parmesan. And they never believe me when I tell them that a grilled cheese sandwich when I was a kid was 2 slices of Wonder, off-brand Wonder, with a slice of American cheese, microwaved.
Yep.
And that was what we thought a grilled cheese was. So what changed for you? What turned you into people who were interested in good cooking and good eating?
Probably we got a little more time. We had friends who enjoyed good food, like Harlan and Nancy Walker. Harlan was pretty much a gourmet cook. Our friends Janet and Chuck could cook Mexican food like nobody's business. Oh my God,
I remember that.
So it started becoming more of a central part of our lives. It wasn't just, here's this microwave grilled cheese sandwich, eat it or starve. It was, okay, Harlan and Nancy are coming for dinner. We have to fix something. So as you get a little older, we just developed more sophisticated friends. And your dad has always had a liking. He's always enjoyed cooking, and he's gotten better at it. And we take opposite paths to cooking because he's the scientist. He follows a recipe to the quarter of a teaspoon, and I just throw stuff together, but it works. And I think we've both turned into pretty good cooks.
Is it influenced a lot by reading your cooking?
Absolutely. For instance, you asked me offline about memorable meals. We had friends who had been traveling for a long time, neighbors, and they were coming back, and we were all happy to get our little neighborhood group together. So we hosted a dinner party, and usually it's all potluck and very casual, but we made beef bourguignon, and it was Julia Child's recipe, but it had been edited by Ina Garten, and it was one of the best meals we've ever prepared.
Did you used to watch Julia Child?
No. Well, I think her TV shows were a little before my time. I'm sure I've watched a lot of her reruns, but no, I never watched it. I remember your grandma Carol got her huge cookbook one year for Christmas and was just blown away by it. And I don't know how much grandma actually made out of it, but she was very impressed.
She was a very experimental cook.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad you found it now.
You'll be glad next Christmas.
I'm going to be so glad. I can't wait to try, because I've never tried Julia Child's beef bourguignon. Okay. So anything else you want to tell me about from this book?
The reason that I ended up choosing it, and I've given this book to a couple people as a gift, is I got so much from it, not just some good recipes, but I had experiences thanks to this book, the oyster shucking, and then our day in Beaufort, South Carolina, and Charleston. He talks a lot about Charleston, South Carolina. And books that I've read that he recommended in his cookbook: A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway, a book called The Sunday Wife, and it's about a minister's wife. I haven't read that one yet. And one of the best books I've read in the past few months, The Water is Wide by Pat Conroy. And it's the story of his first year as a teacher on one of the outer islands in South Carolina. And at the time, he wasn't a liberal. There was really no such thing, but he was just horrified at the racism that was happening there, that was alive and well there, and the way these children were treated. Your dad read this book too and just absolutely loved it. And he worked there for a year before he got fired. And it was life-changing for him. And the book is absolutely wonderful. And when we went to the South, we went to a couple of plantation tours, but we saw a presentation by a Gula woman. So we learned about that lifestyle. And once again, it was just such a rich experience. Charleston especially built its reputation on everybody here's just so happy, and oh, this plantation was just the most wonderful place to live. And it lasted for a long time, but it has changed drastically. And we did go to a plantation there, and they told us about a 10-year-old girl who died in childbirth and a 15-year-old boy who died of malnutrition. It was not what it was portrayed. And even Charleston is, facing up to that. And it's much more rounded now. And I think we're getting a much better perspective.
What other places have you visited because of a book?
Oh, golly. All of our travels, I think I can point to books and experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, and Dad constantly drags you to World War II sites.
Oh, my God, yes. And the Oregon Trail. Oh, that's a special one on our road trips. We were on a trip once, and I was just at the end of my rope, and I said, if you say Oregon Trail one more time, I'm getting out of this car, which he probably would have liked. But yeah, we did we did a lot of the Oregon Trail once.
Tell me what you're reading right now.
Oh, actually, I'm kind of floundering. I'm probably going to have to reread something because I just finished our book club book, which I did not enjoy. I finished Chris Bohalian. He wrote a book called The Buffalo Soldiers. He wrote Midwives.
Mm-hmm.
Written several good novels, and I just read Buffalo Soldiers, and it was really good. It's a sad story, but kind of hopeful. So I like stories with depth. I like to care about the people I'm reading about. Now, I can hate them. That's okay. But I have to have some feeling towards the people. And that was the thing about Remarkably Bright Creatures. I didn't care about these people. They just didn't interest me at all. And I don't mind hating people, but
yeah, the story's got to keep you going.
The story's got to keep me going. And Dad's reading Horse. Have you read that yet? It's Geraldine March.
Oh, yes, it's on my library list. Now I remember this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably the last really great book I read.
Is he liking it?
He's having a little trouble getting into it because it's kind of fiction-y at the beginning. But I told him to stick with it because it's all based on a true story. And when he gets to the story of this actual horse, I think he'll enjoy it tremendously. But we'll see.
Yeah, you guys are, because of you two also, I read Seabiscuit.
Oh, yeah.
Come on. A horse book is a great book.
Yeah. Yeah. And who'd have thought?
Who'd have thought? We're not horse people at all.
Yeah.
All right, Mom. Well, this has been very fun talking to you as always. Thank you for always being my book recommender in chief.
And you do the same for me. Every time I listen to your podcast, I write down the names of books. Then I go to Thrift Books and
buy them all. See?
Yep.
I'm glad to be of service. Well, thank you for joining me today, and I can't wait to see what you recommend next.
Well, thank you. This has been fun.
Bookworms, I am in such a rut in my cooking life, and I would love to hear what cookbooks you're liking these days. But I'm not making pickled shrimp because I still think that sounds gross. Let me know your thoughts over on Instagram at Best Book Ever Podcast. Links to everything Mom and I discussed are available in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review wherever you're listening. If you want to learn more about my weekly guests, as well as get a little peek into what I'm reading and listening to in my free time, subscribe to my weekly pod newsletter at bestbookeverpodcast.substack.com. The newsletter is free, but once you get there, you'll be able to see a few different paid options if you want to help me keep the candles burning over here in my reading cave. Thanks for joining me today, and as always, I will see you at the library. I got to get Dad on the podcast, but I'm afraid he's going to make me read a World War II book.